Okay, I welcome you to another episode of Learning Stories. This is an audio and video show where we interview a diverse set of learners from the 21st century. On each episode of this show, we interview a guest who has a story to share about how they acquired a set of skills and knowledge in a creative and innovative manner. In the process, we hope to uncover a new understanding of learning as conceptualized, imagined, and narrated by the guest in our show. Today's guest, Minaz Ansari, is someone who I fortunately found in a platform called Substack. She's one of my favorite writers on the platform. A little bit about Minaz before we jump into this conversation. Minaz is an architect, urban researcher, and writer. She's also a teacher, traveler, art and history nerd, book and nature lover, a dreamer, and an incurable optimist. She's currently a professor at the Rizvi College of Architecture in Mumbai, India, and she has occupied this role since 2010. She received a bachelor in architecture from Savitribai Phule Pune University in 1998 and a master's in architecture from the University of Mumbai in 2020. In addition to this, she's also received additional qualifications, the GPPM degree from Nikmar University in Construction Management in 2010. She's the author of Pani Pati and an upcoming book which she will be talking about today as well. So, Minaz, and Spread Love, Only Love is the name of her wonderful Substack on the platform. And I highly recommend following up this conversation by exploring the archives over there, which I have done and I have thoroughly enjoyed too. So, Minaz, thank you for making time for this. I really appreciate you taking time out from your schedule for this. And the reason I was excited to do this conversation was because I knew you had a lot of stories, as someone that lives in Bombay, that has done walks in Bombay, but also through your research and your conversations with your students, I think we're going to have a lot of stories today. But I wanted to start off with your story. What was Minaz like as a student growing up? If you could tell me some stories from your childhood, where you went to school and what were some of your memories of that time, that would be a great way to start.
Which was very driven, very competitive, like student image. But alongside that, there was one side of me which was always questioning things. So, in that sense, I would always find myself as a misfit in the education system, in the social circles, because I never took things at face value. I always questioned things, and I had this intense quest for learning, curiosity as a child. So perhaps that's what kept me going and driven in school with my academia and other co-curricular activities. But it was never just accepting whatever was said, but ruffling some feathers along the way with teachers and elders by questioning the status quo. So I grew up in Bombay initially. My family was here, and I saw a very different Bombay that time when housing and spaces for children to play were not as scarce as they are today. And after that, we moved to Nashik because my dad was an engineer with Minaz and Mahindra, and they set up a plant there. We were part of the research and development department, and we moved there. So for me, that was a very big shift from a busy city and with in an apartment with a lot of friends and having a very active social life. I went into a much smaller town, which was more. I mean, where we lived also was a new area. So I was always surrounded by say construction sites, and that's when I started taking solace in books. That boredom really drove me to reading more. I always loved reading, but Bombay I never had that much opportunity. But Nasik gave me that opportunity because I joined a library, and yeah, I think that was one of the things. And because perhaps I was so close to construction sites, those also became spaces to explore. So even as a kid, I always remember looking at half-built structures, seeing them coming up from ground, and exploring them, games, and so perhaps my inclination towards writing and architecture came from that.
And like this life of a reader, Minaz, like as someone that enjoys reading, do you remember uh, how that habit actually developed? Like was there an adult in your life that,
Yeah,
read
yeah.
voraciously? So, and and tell me more about this library that, you would frequent as well.
So my both my parents and I have an older brother. Everybody is an avid reader. Even today, our discussions are always around what are you reading and all of that. So reading was very natural. I mean, that was perhaps the only what we call it indulgence that we had. So access to a few books. I never grew up with a lot of books. So I had a few books, access to a few books, and that when I moved to Nashik, my mother discovered this place called Apne Vachnalaya, which in Marathi means my library. It was run by this one very nice lady, and she had a collection of books for grown-ups and for children, and that was like what really kept me going. Otherwise, I really didn't have any friends or anything else to do in that little town. So we would go there, and I remember just running through books even while my mother was selecting her books so that I could finish as many books as possible, right there, and then reading while walking back, all those things. Yeah, reading with that library, I still wonder now, when it's still around, and how one little space can, give so much joy to people. Just one little room. It was not like a big fancy library. It was just one little room stacked with books and comic books and magazines for older people. I used to read what my mother read also, sometimes in secret. So I learned speed reading. She would be taking a bath and I would be reading her Mills and Bones and all of that. So yeah, that was a rebel in me.
That was a rebel in me
To explore whatever the others were doing. Yes.
Yes. But that's so sweet, because I feel like I know that's a common passion for both of us, the spaces, the library spaces, in our cities, and just to hear the story about how that small space had such an impact on your life in the long run, just got me thinking about how surrounding children with, a wide variety of books is
Absolutely.
so important to develop that habit in the long run. And, as um, and I'm curious about what you observed growing up about how the city has changed, Minaj. Like because I think the way you look at cities is very different, and I know we'll jump into that in our conversation too. But growing up, as a young student, then going to university, like what were some things you observed about not only how Bombay changed, but about how cities in India, at least the cities you were living and studying in, changed over that period?
So I think the whole idea of what development means has changed. Uh, Today we see development in the form of transport systems, say flyovers and sea links and big coastal roads, perhaps even things like airports, fast trains, and all of that. Mobility. We are trying to add speed to life. We are trying to design for as many cars as possible. Um, I think growing up, development really meant perhaps I don't know whether that was a development at that time, but the way we saw cities were through safety, public spaces, access, public transport. So having we never had scarcity of place to play, even in Bombay. I mean, I grew up in a very modest apartment, but we had a huge. In fact, next week I will be writing about the trees that I grew up with on Substack. So one of the trees I keep remembering is was in Bombay, outside my apartment. There was a fairly large space for us to play and a tree or two to climb. Today, if you look at the most luxurious apartments in Bombay, uh, they would be built on a podium. Parking, there are 4-5 levels of parking, and then you have a podium, and the residential area start above that. Of course, you may have other amenities, gym and some schools and all that. But a child growing up today has no access to Mother Earth. There is not a single tree on that site. So it's a huge change, right? We are just going further away from nature. I mean, of course, urban environments have been distinct from nature in that sense, but still we did have some connection to natural elements through ground, through trees, through plants, in Bombay through the coast. Uh, so, how many people really have access to that? Even the older apartments, everything has been paved around the apartments, and it is used for parking. So, cars are getting more priority than human beings. Also, I found that cities are accessible to uh, the elderly. I never saw my grandparents or other elderly people in our vicinity struggling for access, to the market or to visit a doctor or pick up their grandchild from school. But today you need a car. Our footpaths are encroached or broken or non-existent. Traffic has grown multiple. Uh, Public transport or even the paratransit or auto rickshaws are not easily available. So the elderly and the children perhaps don't find a place in our new city. I often say that our cities are designed for healthy, wealthy young men. And I mean that's something which we should.
Yeah, so many points to hit down on there, Minaz, and I think as a resident of the city, and I think different areas give you different experiences for sure. I feel like the lack of walkways and pathways, it is a big deterrent, to actually walk peacefully. And if and I think there's not enough awareness about the importance of those spaces, because it's easier for younger people to walk through spaces that are encroached. They'll just walk on the road, but it's very unsafe for older people, for younger children to walk along the side of the road. It's a very Bombay thing to do, where we don't walk on the pavement, we actually walk on the road, and we walk really parallel to the cars in a lot of ways, sometimes coming towards us. So I think more awareness on that, I think, is extremely important.
And if you look up the data on road accidents in Bombay, it's quite worrisome. There are a large number of road accidents which happen, and perhaps they don't get reported often enough. So I think digital media also plays a big role in how we see our city. When we feel that we have progressed, we've gotten better because we have flyovers and all of that. But there is another side to it. In fact, I remember Mrs. Selena, who's a very senior professor, sociologist. She had recently, I heard her say this, that if you want to look at progress, do not look at what is going on top of the flyover. See the life that is there below the what's happening there. That will be an indicator of what progress you're seeing. So perhaps progress would be more to do with schools, better healthcare, public schools, which I think have improved in Bombay. At least. I see a lot of the BMC schools better maintained, and even in terms of teaching, they're taken over by these NGOs like Asima Foundation and others. So it's not all bad, that the past is at the present day. But as citizens, we need to be aware. How do we define progress? Do we have enough healthcare for everyone? Affordable healthcare, affordable housing, and affordable education. These are three things which I think are very important, so that everybody progresses. Progress is not there only for a certain set of.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that balanced outlook is so important. And I think your participation as a citizen within your community also aids that, right? Like, I think you can reflect on your own access, but understanding how that changes depending on class, depending on, area also really matters in that regard. But, Minaz, going back to your education and your training, as an architect, you completed a Bachelor of Architecture degree in the mid 1990s. And I'm just curious, like, moving from high school to university, did you always know you wanted to be an architect? Were there other professions you were curious about?
So again, joining architecture was like an act of rebellion for me. At that time, if you're good at studies, then you either become an engineer or you become a very clear. You take up science and you pursue one of these. And my grandfather was very keen that I become a doctor. And my dad is an engineer, my brother is an engineer. So they were very keen that I take up engineering. And I had the chance to do that. But somehow I was always inclined towards the arts. So maybe, just visual arts of sketching and painting or three-dimensional arts and crafts and things like that. So I thought I saw an element of that in architecture and I like a balance between the arts and the sciences. So that's why I finally, took up. I did not know much about it. I did not have anyone in the family who was really an architect or from the building industry. So I went in pretty blind. But yeah, the idea was to balance out between the arts and the sciences, the left and the right brain, which is what it turned out to be. So I'm glad about that. I had also considered journalism as one of my career options. Uh, I looked at any other creative design fields. I was open to that, but those were getting a little extremely radical for that time, and architecture worked out. So I'm glad I did it.
Yeah, because I think for a long time, growing up in a middle class house in India, the expectations were quite set in stone, especially in terms of what you wanted to do professionally.
Mm.
Like, you had certain careers that were placed in a pedestal.
Yeah. Even schools, teachers, the career counselors, they would all point out towards say engineering or medicine.
Yeah. And I think sometimes subconsciously that also goes into the back of the student's mind, right? I think as educators now we become more cognizant of it.
Mm.
But reflecting on that, sometimes I also think it was coming from a space of love in terms of security for the child, but it also um, can affect how the child looks at other professions beyond the ones that we prefer, in terms of our daily conversations and language around them. And because you are also a professor now, Minaz, and I know we're going to spend, a considerable time on your writing in this particular part, but what is it like to study architecture, in India today, like in terms of the structure of a course? Like, how is that broken down, and what are some of the things a student normally studies over that period at the undergraduate and graduate level?
I think one of the things that architecture education does, it creates a paradigm shift in the mind of the students in terms of ways of learning. See, so far you have been exposed to reading, writing, math, and examination system, or at the most lab work. But here you're suddenly thrown into say collaborative, learning, where you're working in teams, you're working on real life, sites, at least if not projects. Uh, Learning by doing, you're making models, you're making drawings, you're meeting a lot of people. Architecture will not happen in the confines of a classroom or a studio also. The studio projects also take you out to meet a lot of people. So you start discovering society. Somewhere, as children, we are unfettered and we see only the the social groups that we usually mingle in as a family. But now you're suddenly going and interviewing people, you are doing surveys and even documenting, photo documenting things which perhaps you have never noticed. You start seeing your own environment around you very different, city around you very different. So you start reading people, places very different. I think that's one of the biggest shifts that happen as a part of architecture school learning. So, which I feel is a very good thing and can be adapted to other streams as well. Like the other stream, I mean, many other streams, maybe, it is also changing other disciplines, but it's a good kind of pedagogical framework to adapt to any of the other, even schooling systems.
Yeah, and I see some of that even come through in your writing, Minaz. Like what I really like about your newsletter, Spread Love, Only Love. I see this intersection of history, politics, sociology in the way urban spaces are designed. And many of your pieces on Spread Love, Only Love are also about the buildings that inhabit cities, but the people that live in those buildings. And there are so many stories I read in your archives of people that occupy these spaces and are the residents of those spaces. Like in your mind, how do you think that intersects, and in terms of how history, sociology, psychology intersects with design as a concept, because you have the lens of someone that is a practitioner and someone that also teaches from a theoretical lens. So how does that intersection actually happen?
See, there's this very famous quote by an Austrian architect, Ansari, who said everything is architecture. So you can't isolate the built environment from anything around it. In fact, everything that happens, you know, around us happens in a built environment or around the built environment. Sometimes in a natural environment, but mostly in a built environment. So understanding all these layers of sociology, culture, history, politics, um, and of course, space, aesthetics, um, uh, law and legislation, people, and ecology of people, how they experience spaces, how they experience cities. All this comes somewhere in the framework of architecture and urban design. I think a lot of this uh, realizations happen because of my masters in urban design, which kind of led us understanding the city, actually de-layer the city, like a scientific lab where you take a specimen and de-layer it and under the microscope look at each layer separately. We would actually do that, and we continue doing that for every place that I visit. So there are so many ways of looking at the same city. In fact, Italo Calvino's book Invisible Cities is an excellent example of that. Right? He's looking at a city through different. So I think that's where observations come about. Right? You can't contain architecture or urban design or urban planning to a set of non-living, enclosures or built form. It is about life, the life that really exists in it. That's what we are finally designing for, right? So the observations that come out of all the research and the projects that I have done is finally what comes into my writing.
Yeah. And like, because I'm thinking about what you said in the context of a particular part of the city. Like if we take an area like Bandra, like now it's considered one of the most developed parts of Mumbai as a city. It's the place that everyone wants to go to,
Hmm.
but more recently, when I would visit Bandra, I did find it difficult to walk through the pathways and the walkways, to get to certain places, the signs. So, like, if because you're also coming into this from someone that is an urban design researcher, so if you could give me some examples of spaces in Bandra, and some positive examples, some examples that can be improved about Bandra as and I think Bandra is so vast. The east and the west is so different, because on the east, I think the landscape is so different. On the west, the
Hmm.
landscape is so different. And I think that's something that's particularly unique to Bombay. Like, people have a mental model of what it's like to live on the east and the west,
Hmm.
and it changes depending on what area you are in. But tell me more about Bandra as a landscape, and what have you observed about this part of Bombay as an urban design researcher?
So I started studying Bandra in 2019. Actually walking up and down the streets and mapping certain parts of Bandra to understand, like I said, all these layers. One is the morphology of the space. What kind of what is a form of the buildings that are there in Bandra. Second is the functionality. What are the activities that happen here? Uh, then the experience, which we call the perceptual layer. How do you experience the spaces? What is the sensory experience? Is it only visual, or is it also auditory? Is it also the sense of smell, or the sense of space? Um, or other than that, then I also looked at things like the socio-economic aspects, like communities. Who are the communities over there? What is the culture that drives these the development of these spaces? And also visually, what is the kind of aesthetic that is there in these neighborhoods. So that led me down this whole rabbit hole of the history of Bandra and the people of Bandra and the geography of Bandra, which drives, geography always drives history. It will always be interconnected. Whether if you look at the Indus Valley civilization or the Egyptian civilization or any of the ancient Mesopotamian civilization, they were all driven by geography, right? There was a river around which people, settled down. Or even if you look at the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, it was a very treacherous terrain, which led them to become seafarers. And then the Mediterranean Sea became a space for exchange of trade and commerce and all of that. So geography always determines history. As in the case of Bandra, also it was this island, and there was a little water point at the edge of it where the ships used to stop to pick up fresh water, and then that's how it got colonized by the Portuguese, and then later the British, and the local who have lived here for like hundreds of years, their whole journey of embracing Christianity and still retaining their local language. They speak like a Marathi, which has got a little Portuguese twang to it. Their food is again, a mix of cultures. A lot of the uh, rituals and practices are again an intermingling of two cultures. So all of that was really fascinating, and then all that is what shapes the urban form. What do you do? Their livelihoods. It's a very long peninsula coast, so there were a lot of fisher folk. The plains were where paddy beans and other vegetables and other things were grown. So there were a lot of the agriculturists and farmers who were here. So they were toddy tappers, the salt pan workers, potters, and woodworkers. So these communities have come together and shaped Bandra. And in the recent, like past 100 years or so, things have changed faster. The building of the Mahim Causeway, people moving here on, say, a bandstand after the plague because it was, one of those busy areas. So there were a lot of the sanatoriums and convalescent homes there. Then you had another wave of migration which happened after the Mehboob studio was built, and the film fraternity started. So there are various cultural layers which exist and which shape the built form of Bandra. In this unraveling all this, understanding all this, has been a very fascinating journey for me. In fact, what happens is today, if you look at, if you know, Bandra has acquired this reputation of being this very, hip suburb with the ceiling and shopping and pubs and clubs and cafes. Cafe culture is, the new thing in Bandra and all of that. But that's not the only thing. That is only a surface. It's a veneer, and under which there is a whole uh, bunch of communities who've lived here for hundreds of years, and they are perhaps struggling to survive this new change which has happened. And what happens to their houses and what happens to the cluster of villages? Bandra was made of 25 villages. Today, even today, there are at least 8, 10 of them which survive in whatever little form. There may be 10 houses or 8 houses, or some of them are larger and well preserved. So, in the middle of urbanization, you suddenly enter the street and you feel like you go back in time. Then you have these cottages, and you can hear music coming out of people's homes. You can smell the food that is being cooked, hymns being sung. There's a small village square, so it's a uh, real contrast in that sense of urbanization and coexisting, or I don't know how coexisting, but yeah, there is a whole layer of private heritage which continues to be a part of Bangalore, which can be seen only if you will never. I mean, I drove around Bandra for years and I never saw it. Only when I started walking and studying and stopping and observing things, that's when all these layers started becoming apparent, and that's when I started taking these Bandra walks over weekends. Trying to make people see these very fascinating stories of Bandra and how it has changed, how urbanization is slowly changing things over time. And only when we know what we value and what's there, then we will preserve it. If we are not aware, then we will never be able to preserve what we have in terms of tangible and intangible.
Yeah, but like that's beautifully put, Minaz. And when you were speaking, I was just thinking about how the development model in the two different, like Bandra East and Bandra West, is so different. Like when I
Yeah,
go to Bandra East, it seems so controlled, narrative driven, like structured. Um, like Bandra Kurla complex, it's so different compared to maybe Chumbai village, and the- it's it's completely contrasting models, but in the same lot larger space of what development can mean. And I completely agree. I think one of the most beautiful aspects of Bandra is walking in the back alleys and seeing these old cottages that have been preserved, and you have communities and sub communities, old bakeries, also the linguistic and the cultural diversity. It's such a um, symbol for what the country is in terms of the diversity, but also the different cultures. You have churches, you have mosques, you have temples, all coexisting in this
yes,
larger sort of
yes.
space, as you had said. And like, what does a walk look like, Minaz? You told me that you do these walks over the weekends, like, and I think that's such a fascinating concept to engage with your city. Like, people always think of entertainment as a movie or a play or a music performance, but tell me more about why would people want to go on a walk to understand their city.
I think curiosity which brings people for the walk, and wanting to know more about Bandra, which is a very good. In fact, not just Bandra, various parts of the city. There are a lot of people who are now spending their weekends walking. There are so many experts out there who are talking, about the city through various frameworks. So there are a lot of historical books about history and heritage, and there are food walks and all of that. So I mean, being an urban designer and architect, I talk about the urban transformation of uh, Bandra, which encompasses this whole story of Bandra in the last 500 years and how it has changed. And when you experience it, when you actually walk down those roads and see the people around, see how art and culture, continues to thrive in small pockets of Bandra. How architecture has evolved. How small things like the edges of the streets, like when you're in a cottage, the edge of your house is near the street. So you are, it's a very porous kind of a boundary. You can talk to your neighbors who are passing by. Or, now it has become also a privacy issue because you have so many cars and all moving on those paths. But as you go, into a, let's say, a bigger villa, there's a compound wall to come up. So there's a physical boundary, but you still have a visual connect. And then you have an apartment or a tower which comes up, which is, say, a tall compound wall, or it has these parking segment. So suddenly the street has become very hostile in that sense. So these transformations you experience only when you walk around. And I think people come for the stories, and even what I like to do is also share stories. Finally, every place has a story, and that's what makes the walk. And I always learn from the people who come there because their questions sometimes make me look into different aspects that perhaps I have not thought of. Or people bring in connections which are very interesting, between other parts of the city and Bandra, or between something they've seen. Children, I have taken walks for small children, and those are the most fascinating walks that I've had, where their sense of observation is very keen, and we make it fun. Like, it's like a treasure hunt for small elements that, and it's really enlightening to see how they see this. I wish we could not become cynical adults and continue with that innocence and curiosity that a child has. Perhaps we would be better city planners.
Right. I think those walks must be such a delight for the younger kids, but I it also helps them understand the communities that they stay in.
Yes,
How diverse it is in terms of what we expect. I think in large urban metros, again, this is not the reality of everyone, but we normally stay in these closed off areas if you come from a certain background. But I think it changes depending on what part of the city you live in. Because uh, the concept of space is very different in different space. Like Bombay, I think space is one of the things that most people have at the back of their mind, right? When you are moving in a train, when you are moving in the streets, you always have people. Like if you stretch your hand, there is someone around you.
yeah,
So I think the same thing applies to homes. Not. I think it there is a sense of privilege to even have your own room or have your own space because it's very expensive in a city like I think Bombay is one of the most expensive cities
yeah,
to live in. If you're coming out into the city as an immigrant, starting from scratch as well. So I feel like walks are just great ways to see that. Also, when you said 500-year timeline, I was like so intrigued because in our minds we often try to look and analyze life based on our own timeline. For the next 50 years, what is going to happen to my city? But I'm thinking it would be so nice to expand it. It's not only about your life. What came before you? What came after
yeah.
you? Where will it go beyond that? And in terms of teaching, Minaz, like I know you've been a teacher since 2010. Like, what has if you could tell me a little bit about that experience, because I know it's not just teaching, it's also research. So, what is the intersection of teaching and research in an urban design sort of context look like for someone like you?
See, I mean, if I look back at my journey for the past 15 years in academia, I think it is almost like studying and learning about architecture every single day. As it is said that if you want to master something, teach it. That's the best way to really get into the depth of any topic. And I think that's what teaching has done. I mean, it was one of the biggest shifts that has happened in my not I would not just say career, but my worldview. One is I taught with some excellent mentors. Rizvi was the founding principal, Professor Akhtar Chauhan. He's a visionary. So for the first time, I came across a vision where he spoke about architecture not just as a profession or a vocation, but as a means to bring about change in the world. He always talked about architecture as a service for humanity and a tool to bring about affordable housing, beauty habitats, and on the other hand, there was Professor Pradnya who is still a very uh, skilled designer. So we have this foundation design course called Basic Design. So she has been teaching all her life since she was a student for 4 decades, I guess. And she's basically written a book about it, learning basic design, which is something which it can be applied to any design discipline. So that teaching that course changed the way looking at design, aesthetics, scale, proportion, principles, elements, color, texture, everything, everywhere. And once it, that's the way you start looking at the world, then you can't go back. You can't unlearn it, you can't unsee it, and you see it everywhere, not just in nature, but everywhere. So these two things, I think, and we organize these international conferences every year. We still try to do it. So we started in 2001. So since then, the college is organizing international conferences on developing humane habitats, and that brought in scholars from all over the world, and that kind of also led to a lot of new ways of looking at architecture, looking at people, looking at society, looking at the city. Uh, so teaching has been, like I said, one of the biggest shifts that have happened in my career and the way I look at the world. And besides these, I would say being students, is one of the biggest gifts that teaching gives. I mean, I'm sure you understand that as well. And the kind of energy that comes from engaging with young people. The like I said, lack of cynicism, a certain innocence, a certain hope, a certain belief, yes, to change the world is something which it is constantly reaffirmed every time you see a new design, every time you see a new vision for making a better space, a better city. In their visitations, they come up a lot of interesting social issues in gender, politics, or even the way space experienced, uh, public spaces, transport. So there's always hope. Every thesis is a hope that yes, there is a possibility of having a better world. And teamwork, working across each groups. So to start off with, it's a 5 year. So first 5 years, you may have a teacher and a student, which is also very different because we have these studios where you're constantly interacting one on one. So it's not one to many, one to one kind of interactions and ideation. Not it's not a one-way process. I'm delivering a class and everybody is just listening to what I'm saying. Even our lectures interactive. Uh, we have a lot of debates and discussions around books and movies and social issues and all that. So there's space for dialogue. So understanding points and developing lifelong habits. So after 5 years, then back. I remember last year I had my place, and later I was looking at those pictures and all these are my students. All of them, them and their family. Some of them had kids and whatever, but they were all connected to me because I taught them at. So developing meaningful relationships is also something which I think has stemmed out of being associated with an architecture too. I think that
I love that, Minaz, because uh, I think your impact in the long run, there must be so many students that you worked with over this 15-year period that are architects, urban researchers in their own contexts.
yeah,
And I feel like a teacher's impact is not felt, in the immediate sort of um, couple of years, but I think it goes way beyond that
yes,
as well as you were saying, and I think um, it's so beautiful to see your students come back in different ways and see how things have turned out for them. But I can't imagine the joy you must feel as an educator at that pivotal stage in their life, shaping their minds as professionals. And then you see them coming back later, as competent professionals doing that in their particular spaces, in their particular fields. It's just amazing. I think it's one of the unsaid joys of being a teacher, which
absolutely,
and I think we underestimate the long-term impact of a good teacher.
absolutely,
But hearing you speak, I feel like it would be so lovely to be a student in your classroom because you're so intuitive and you're also so interactive, right? You don't just come into it thinking you are the expert. You believe that the student has something to bring into that environment, and you're co-creating a
yes,
space where people can learn, which I think at its core is what architecture is. It's a conversation, it's a collaboration. Again, from the outside, that's what it looks like to me, but hearing you, that's what I'm sort of coming to as well.
I don't know whether my students would say that. They would say she's a very hard taskmaster. That's also part of the deal. I think with for students of that age, what they need is um, respect and a non-judgmental outlook. Sometimes education systems start putting you into certain boxes and judging you based on certain criterias, and that is something which is a major setback in one's life. If you carry that to stars for life, and once you're able to break that and see something, there's always something unique about everyone. So try to pick out that, or let them find it out, but let them be, give them that space to be, and treat everyone with a sense of respect. Like, they do I mean, they do bring a lot to the table, and everybody has their own time when they will uh, kind of find themselves. So we have to give them that space. It's a very complex world that the teens are growing in. It's very complex with the pressure of social media and everything else. Including the world. It's not an easy world to go. So we have to have a lot of patience. I used to be a very impatient teen at the start, but then I realized that perhaps that doesn't work. It doesn't work. I mean, with the best of intentions, it doesn't work. You need to allow them their time. You can just plant a seed, and it will whatever, emerge when it will.
How beautiful. Yeah. And Minaz, I'm such a fan. I came to know of your work through your writing. I know Substack is a small piece of your actual writing. You do a lot of academic writing, and in our previous conversation, you told me that writing has been a core part of your professional identity for a very long time. It's not just something that has come up more recently. So not just with Substack, I wanted to share an image of Minaz's upcoming book, which uh, which she will talk about today. So I'm just going to bring that up. So Minaz, I'm just keeping this on the screen. Like, if you could just tell me about the story of this book, but also about your relationship to writing, not just through Substack, but through your academic writing and your journalism, in popular media. I'd love to. I'm curious about how you use writing to tell stories about urban design and architecture. Uh,
So I think if I can pick one consistent thing which has been a part of my journey ever since I learned to articulate myself in words. Um, it has been writing. So whether it was as a student in school or in my architecture course, even as a practicing architect, um, I have been writing for architecture magazines and newspapers. And of course, teaching gave me a huge platform to write and research and all of that. But it always started as a fascination with words. I am I've always been fascinated with words, whether it was literature or poetry or even music. I would always look out for song lyrics and jot them down somewhere. Calligraphy. Today I look at signage. Building signage is also fascinating. One of my research projects was on Bandra building signages. So word meanings, etymology, any form of words is something which really fascinated. And therefore, reading and as an extension of that, writing uh, was always a part of me. I mean, I sometimes I wonder. I mean, I read what I write, and I wonder, I don't know how I've really written this, but it somehow just goes through me. I don't know how I do it without any much external push. It's not really a requirement for me to write, except for academic papers. Whatever else I do is all self motivated. So yeah, I think writing is also about, like you said, telling a story. So the curious person in me is always looking out for these stories behind, or the uh, banal existence of things. Why is it the way it is? Like Sanjay Patil, who practices in Nashik. So what fascinated me about his story was that he studied in JJ College, and this was in the 1980s, 1980s, and could have had a fantastic career in Bombay, but he chose to go back to Nashik, which was a very small town at that point in time. People didn't know who an but he chose to bit by bit transform the city through his architecture, which was also inspired by the vernacular architecture in Maharashtra. So Vada architecture, those courtyards inside, connection with nature, verandas and balconies and open spaces. So to an extent where he became a role model to our generation. And today, if you look at Nashik, if you actually go visit private homes in Nashik, you'll find most of them being extremely, well designed. Same with the institutional buildings. Nashik also has today a lot of campuses, and they all are either designed by him or studied or worked with him or inspired by him. So it's that one little journey to create a ripple effect. And because he chose to go back to take that hard path to uh, set up a practice in Nashik, non-existent. So that's what really drove me to that book, and that was the first book that I wrote. And later during the pandemic, I was working on a project called Mumbai Water Narrative, where I was a curator or a co-curator for an exhibition on stories of water in Bombay. So this was part of Living Waters Museum, which is a platform which extensively does research and exhibitions, virtual exhibitions on stories around water. So they have stories from Goa and Calcutta and Pune and many other parts of the country. It's led by Dr. Sara Ahmad, I mean, her entire career has been associated with work around water and river systems and all of that. So when we were doing that project, we realized that we need to reach out to the younger generation, children, because finally they are the water keepers of the future, and they are seeing water only as a commodity. It comes in a tap, and that's how they see it, or in a bottle, or in a purifier. So we came up with the way of reaching out to them through a picture book, and I wrote this book called Pani Party. So it's a fun little picture book which is set in the lockdown, and also a book which talks about a conversation between a grandparent and a grandchild. Another very important mode of learning and passing on wisdom uh, to other generations. So this was something which was again a passion project, because we wanted to reach out to as many children as possible with a simple story which makes them see value in what. Once you see value in something, you start taking care of it. So I've had these fantastic sessions where again interactive storytelling and Q&A and art sessions with children around water, and they come up with the most fabulous little observations around water. And so that was one project which I thoroughly enjoyed. In fact, I think the book has been reprinted. It has been printed in published in German, and we are working on the Marathi translation as well. So that was another book I was working on. And the third book which I recently completed is the one which you were talking about. I can share the screen, then I can show you the cover page. It's soon to be launched, and this is for MMRDA. They have come up with a set of maps to walk and explore the city. So it's a set of 10 maps, and each map is going to be associated with a book. So I was assigned this book on Mumbai suburbs, which covers Bandra and the coast of the suburbs, and also the interiors, but mostly the coastal villages. So from Khar, Pelepale, Juhu, Versova, Mud, then Aksa, and Manori, Uttan, Kulvem, Gorai, that entire coastal edge. It has some fascinating little urban village precincts, has churches and housing societies, a lot of private heritage, which even from Bandra, half the book is Bandra. A lot of private heritage, and of course, the listed heritage buildings from Bandra, and also buildings around Andheri, Versova, Kandivali, Borivali. So we have a lot of Buddhist heritage. So starting with the Kanheri caves to the Mandapeshwar caves, then you have the Shaivite cave and Mahakali. So all that has also been covered in this book, and it's a guidebook. It's, guiding you as you walk along these streets, and what is it that you can observe at a building, or you walk through it. So this was a project which was very research intensive. It took me, I started in 2020, and then we just wrapped up a few months back, and it's due for launch now. As in when MMRDA organizes the launch, these books will be available at a very affordable price, because we wanted to reach out to people, and I hope people read these books and explore the city on foot. And there's so much written about the island city, port, and other parts of the island city. But there's very little that we have about Mumbai suburbs, and it is rich with history and heritage and some fascinating architecture to explore. So I'm really looking forward to this coming out.
Such a wonderful idea. I can't wait to buy my own copy, Minaz, and I'd love to read Pani Pati as well, which is something I, hopefully will purchase soon. I'm just so fascinated by how you are able to balance, academic writing, writing personal essays on Substack, writing your books, the Heritage Handbook and Pani Pati, but also, you've been writing as a journalist in like popular media outlets too. It's so many hats that you're wearing, and it's a different audience in each sort of area, but I think it's such important work for bringing out the stories in these larger urban contexts. And I think this is something that any Mumbaiker would love to have in their house. And I when you were talking about the first book of the collection about the architect working in Nashik, I just realized that there are so many such unsaid heroes and stories of individuals, male and female architects that have done such important work in smaller cities across our
Absolutely.
country, which we don't often think about. We often think
Absolutely.
about the metros like Delhi, Bangalore, Calcutta, but so many cities and they all have built environments. There is a researcher, there is an architect, there is a entire team responsible for those buildings, those cities. And I can't imagine how much literature is actually waiting to be uncovered
Absolutely.
in the stories of our smaller cities
Hmm.
and villages, not just
Yes,
cities,
absolutely.
and the infrastructure connecting cities and villages, right? I think there's policy, there's law, there's history,
Hmm.
and I can't wait for you to explore and uncover more of this. For the listeners tuning in, I will be linking notes to Minaz's books, notes to her Substack, and I highly recommend going through the archives there, and notes to other uh, profiles of Minaz beyond this particular conversation. I really think 1 hour is so difficult to talk about Minaz's extensive experience over decades on this particular topic. But Minaz, the last question I wanted to ask you, just to respect time, is some recommendations. Like you are someone that reads widely, that observes closely, and I think I'm just curious for someone interested in architecture, urban design. I'm looking at maybe an entry level resource. It could be a book, it could be a website, it could be a movie. If you have any recommendations off the top of your head, because after talking to you, I'm very curious, not just about Bombay as a city, like I think in a global context, in a national context, any resources that stayed with you that you can recommend to students or citizens and, anyone curious about this topic.
I think, of course, I will mention some books and other resources. But I feel the first thing that we all need to do is walk outside of our homes and explore our own neighborhoods. The best places to see is your own neighborhood. You should know the neighborhood like the back of your hand, and not about only about the landmarks. This is so and so's house, and that is so and so's office, or whatever. But you should know, the smaller informal commerce which happens there. You should know the trees in your neighborhood, which trees flower in which season, what paths should you walk on, during a particular season. You should know about the people who reside in the neighborhood. Maybe I'm not saying at a personal social level, but understand, all of them and from all social strata. Somehow I feel as city dwellers, we are also very kind of oblivious to people who do not fall into our social. I mean, I was also like that before I started. I was started researching and understanding the social mix in a particular neighborhood. And once you understand that, then you actually it helps break down so many barriers. Like I often hear people talking about their worries about theft or whether this place is safe. And very often we figure out that the people who are suspected of these things are the ones who are probably protecting you by being eyes on the street, by setting up that little stall there or living there or being there. So talk to people or observe people with an open mind. Um, Books, it's very hard to recommend books because there are so many of them, so many of them. And uh, recently I read a book by Alice Albania. It's called The Empire of the Indus, which is a journey of Alice, the author, who's a researcher, who followed the Indus from Karachi to Tibet. So through parts of Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, Kashmir, and then Tibet. and the kind of people she met there and the kind of experiences she had. So many of these areas were pretty hostile outsiders or under some political turmoil and therefore not accessible. And in the midst of all of that, she found so many commonalities. She found so many uh, overlaps in uh, rituals, practices, cultures. Though they are coming from various different faiths, how what brings them together, how water brings them together, and of course, the history of our subcontinent through nature, the natural body. I found that book very fascinating as a book and as a uh, a kind of a framework through which we can look at um, the world around us. So that is one book. In fiction, recently I read book which is written by Marcus Luzak. It is a very, I would say, uplifting, optimistic story set in World War II Germany. Extremely well written. So I enjoy reading because you get that way of bringing in the human element. So that one. The another book which I always refer back to is Humankind, written by Rutger Bregman, which his hypothesis is that essentially human beings are kind. Very contrary to what media would allow us to do. And he has given a whole breakdown of his hypothesis with a whole lot of examples throughout the book. So, experiments, observations, and a lot of survey and study. Very substantiated, well substantiated argument, and it's a very hopeful book. So I love that. In terms of movies, okay, so I read this. I saw this very beautiful movie recently. Where did you go, Bernadette? Which I mean, then I would recommend it. It talks about the turmoil of a designer. How a designers get away from design. What kind of so it's like a very light take on it, but very well executed. So that there are a whole lot of documentaries which people must watch. One there's one on Netflix. Is it, uh, just buy or something like that about the the consumerism and its impact on society. So if you want to put it in the link, I'll find out the name and I don't collect the name now. Buy now. Yeah, that's what it is. Buy now. Please watch it. It's an eye opener in terms of how the ad world and the I mean the entire market is pushing products on us in various ways which we don't realize and what it is doing to the environment. Another very important documentary is Seaspiracy. So, as against conspiracy, STA, conspiracy. So, which talks about what we are doing to the oceans in terms of overfishing and the impact that it has, and what is the impact that it will have in the near future, in our lifetimes. What could happen to the oceans, and then if the life in oceans die out, then that's the end of humankind. So these two films, I would say, this recommend. What else? I read a lot of Indian authors, especially books set in cities. So Kiran Nagarkar's um, uh, Ravan and Eddie, set in Bombay. Bombay Chawls. If you want to know Bombay Chawls, Ravan and Eddie. Bombay Balcha by Jane Borges. If you want to understand the Catholic neighborhood in central native part of old Bombay. Then all of Rohit Mistry's books, they are all set in some bag in Bombay. Very, very classic. So, I mean, of course, we have Salman Rushdie and his books set in different cities. But besides that, I mean, he is very popularly known. Perhaps these are not very, they haven't perhaps received that much attention. Merzban Shroff has also written a few books. Jerry Pinto's book. They all kind of, show Bombay in a certain light. So, which is very fascinating.
Yeah, like I think we're so lucky to have access to literature that brings Bombay as a city to life. I think each of these writers, they occupy a very small subculture, like reading Jane Borges's book or reading, you know, even the outsider perspective, but a book like Shantaram or, Sacred Games or Jerry Pinto's Education of Yuri. I think Bombay has so much literature about how, but I think it's also a time capsule about what
Yes,
Bombay
absolutely.
was at a particular point of time. Like Education of Yuri by Jerry Pinto spoke about Bombay in the 80s. And I
Mm.
was reading that, and there were references to places and stations that were so different from what they are today. Ideally, we'd like a book like that for every decade, in
Yeah.
in some way. And I think every city, I love how every city can give you such rich literature if you actually go and see looking.
So I usually try to read a book about a place before I go there, if I can. So there's this The Tobacconist, which is set in World War II Vienna. It's a fascinating book. And there was The Architect's Apprentice, which is set in Istanbul during the Ottoman, era. And Elif Shifa, yeah, who actually talks about the architect who built all the, mosques, which absolutely fascinating. So if you read it before you go there, then it gives you another, it gives you an introduction to the city, even before you've seen it. So, who's that? Hamoud, Burhan, yeah. So he also, always frames his fiction in, real setting.
Yeah,
So I
like
love books
I
like that.
love this. I think that's such a great point. The idea of a city coming to life through fiction. I think that's true. I feel like this recommendations part can be another podcast on its own with you, Minaz, because you have so many recommendations. But for the final part, Minaz, like if someone wants to reach you on the internet, learn about your work, what are some ways they can, read your writing or, learn about what you are doing on a day-to-day basis?
So my writing is on Substack. Books are all available online, and otherwise I'm reachable on Instagram. And usually my uh, point of contact is Instagram. So yeah, always happy to interact. I said always happy to interact with people.
Yeah, and I think even without interacting with you, Minaz, through your writing, I feel like I've developed an understanding of the city that I call home, and I've been here for so long. But um, I think you've helped me look not only at cities but also at spaces in a very different way through your writing. And I'm really excited to explore your books, in the time ahead. And for the listeners tuning in, please follow the show notes. I will include the recommendations that Minaz has also mentioned. But her Substack is a great starting point to explore her world and start off from there. But on that note, to respect time, we come to an end of this episode. Thank you so much, Minaz.
Yes, thanks a lot, Abhishek. It was wonderful having this chat. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And for the listeners tuning in, keep learning. And until next time, stay tuned for more such stories from this podcast.
Thank you. Bye bye. Bye everyone.